so I'm Gabriela Martinez. I'm the director for the Center for Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies, and I am a professor at the School of Journalism and Communication. And it is a pleasure to be here today and to have here with us filmmaker Peter Bratt, who actually, it's a person that I met, and this is gonna, give you my age, but I met him back in the 1990s in the Bay Area when I first migrated to the United States. And I was a young filmmaker from Peru. I wanted to make movies, and I was looking for other people who were making films, and he happened to be related to a good friend of mine from Peru, and that's how we met, actually. And then I kind of lost track of him, so it was I was incredibly happy when I saw Dolores, and that the director of Dolores was Peter Bratt. It really, took me back years in how much we struggle to be filmmakers, especially to be independent filmmakers. So today we are here this is a teaching, so this is to talk about what it means to be a filmmaker, especially an independent filmmaker. With him it's fascinating because he is more of a narrative filmmaker, a fiction filmmaker, but he crosses over to documentary. And that's not very common. Most people go from documentary to fiction. He's doing kind of travel in the reverse. And I will let him talk about his experiences as a filmmaker, and also what does it mean to be a filmmaker who believes in activism, in social change, because his narrative films and also Dolores deal with social issues. All the narrative films that he had produced are dealing with issues of intersectionality, identity, poverty, what is to live in urban areas like La Misión. He's going to be talking about that. And obviously, I mean, Dolores Huerta, who's still alive. He's, I think, in his late 80s and still canvassing, helping register people to vote. So I'm going to give the floor to Peter, and I want to remind everybody that at 4 p.m. we'll be screening Dolores in the Redwood Auditorium, and after that, Peter will be doing a Q&A as well. So help me welcoming Peter Bratt to this teaching.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Gabby. Before we jump in, I'm gonna show you two trailers.
The thing about low riding, we don't really go anywhere. We just take our time getting there. You know what I'm saying? Low and slow. Yo, what up, Che? Trying to make $1 out of 15 cents. You know what I'm saying?
I want all the juicy details. I heard you guys got into it.
I might even ride shotgun. Let him drive.
The king's finally gonna give up the throne.
Hey, man, I said drive, not wear the crown.
What are you gonna tell him?
Make something up, I guess.
What's it this time? Another study group?
You saying I'm lying?
Maybe even tell him the truth.
Dolores is an icon.
She's a civil rights hero.
She's the first general that I followed into war.
She's not afraid to speak truth to power.
Dolores Huerta, who is an old friend of mine.
The FBI knew how dangerous Dolores was. Dolores came up with the slogan, "Si se puede."
Yes, we can.
You were a young girl growing up in America in the 40s. You must have had a dream.
After I had seen the miserable conditions of farm workers, Cesar Chavez said, we have to organize a union. You had this ambience all around you that you could really change the world.
Yeah, the first trailer you saw, La Misión, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2008. It took us 6 years to raise the money to make that film. So we started that film in the early 2000s and eventually premiered at Sundance in 2008. And then it turned out that Carlos Santana saw La Misión And then he called my brother and I one time, and I hadn't met him. And he said, you know, would you show the film to my family? So, yeah. So we showed it to Carlos, and we became brothers. And then shortly after that, Carlos called me one day and said, we have to make a film about Dolores while she's still with us. And she was 80 years old at the time. She's now 87. And like Gabby said, she's still doing it. She travels almost 7 days a week. At 87, she was just down at the Texas border at the detention centers fasting. And right now she's working in the Central Valley registering people to vote for the midterms. Dolores was my first documentary. When Carlos said, we got to do this film, I said, you know, Carlos, I never made a doc before, and that didn't matter to him. And then Dolores got on board, and I said, okay, let's do it. So Dolores was 4.5 years in the making, and we premiered at the 2017 Sundance Film Festival, I believe. And no, 2016. It was the day that we premiered at Sundance was the day that Donald Trump was inaugurated as the 45th president of the United States. And then the very next day was the Women's March on Washington. And they had a women's march in Park City, Utah, and they asked Dolores to lead the march and then give the keynote at the following rally. So at the premiere of the film, my daughter, my wife, my mom, Dolores, you know, my whole family, we were marching, and it was a little bit surreal. And then the film came out later that fall, and then last March it premiered it had its broadcast premiere on PBS, and now it's in universities and high schools throughout the country, and people have developed a curriculum around it, and Dolores has like gone all over. She was a relatively unknown figure outside of the California Mexican American community, and now her story and her work is getting the attention it finally deserves. And a few months back, she was actually honored in Mexico with the highest civilian award, and then last month, Governor Brown declared a state holiday, Dolores Huerta. You don't get the school day off yet, but maybe that'll come one day. And as Gabby said, Dolores is my third film, and I've been making films for over 25 years, and I've only done 3 films. And the reason why is because independent filmmaking is a long, long trek. Like La Misión, it took us 6 years just to raise the money. It took me a year to write the script, and then we were a year in post-production. We had to raise more money. And then even when you finish an independent film, there's no guarantee that it'll ever get distribution. And so you hope and pray that you'll get into one of the premiere festivals. Somebody will see your film, it'll get good notice, and it'll eventually get picked up. And we've been fortunate enough to have that happen with all 3 of our films. So, but it's definitely not for the faint of heart. And you get into it because something drives you to want to tell the stories you tell, because you don't necessarily make a living at it, and you live with it, and your family lives with it, and your friends live with it, and sometimes you get on their nerves because you're constantly trying to raise money or develop the story, and you're constantly getting feedback from the people around you. So it takes a toll on them as well. But then there's nothing like it when you take a film out and you see an audience react to it, and then films like Dolores actually, change a policy, and that's kind of like the height of it for me as a filmmaker, to see that a story, can not only change minds or transform or inspire somebody, but can actually change policy. For me, that's about as good as it gets, So, with that, I'll go ahead and open it to anybody who might have any questions. I know we got some young filmmakers in the audience here. Yeah.
So, where'd you get the money to?
Yeah. Where did we get the financing to make Dolores? And this usually doesn't happen in the independent film world, but like I said, Carlos saw La Misión and wanted to collaborate. And so when he called me up and said, we got to make this film about Dolores, you know, he put his money where his mouth was, and he financed it. And that never happens. You know, usually you have a project like, like right now we're embarking on another documentary, and so, you know, we put together a lookbook. You know, you get visuals and a PowerPoint that look and feel like the film will look, and you do a write-up and those who are involved, and then you go out and start, you know, knocking on doors to raise money. And it's a really, really long years process, but with Dolores, the financing was right there, and that was a luxury. I'm hoping all my other films are going to be like that now from now on, but we'll see. Yeah. And I should say that I went to the University of California at Santa Cruz, and I was a political science major. I never thought I would be a filmmaker. I wanted to, you know, go into teaching or some other thing tied to social justice and work within my community. And then, you know, senior year, I take a film course on the American musical, thinking I'm going to kick back and, you know, eat my bagel in class. And then we ended up having to write a paper a week. A critical paper every week from a Marxist feminist perspective, and that was a mind-blowing experience for me to like start watching film with this critical lens and learn how my own ideas about, you know, gender and class have been informed and influenced, excuse me, by the content that I grew up watching, both on television and on the big screen. And when I realized that, I was, oh my God, I want to be involved in this medium. And then I applied, you know, I went to NYU Film School for graduate work. But to me, the attraction of film was always like how it impacts us socially, how it informs us politically, you know, our identities, you know, where we fit in, histories, whose stories get told, whose stories get left out, who decides all that. To me, that became just as fascinating as the filmmaking process itself, and it still really inspires me to want to continue to make films. Another young filmmaking student.
You talked about the hope of policy changes, so can you talk a little bit more about like your ideal, like the takeaway that people have, or even some of the policy changes you're making?
I mean, I learned a lot from Dolores making this film, this documentary, and one of the takeaways for me, and I'm also the child of a long-term activist. My mom was, you know, knew Dolores, marched with her in Cesar, and also was part of the American Indian movement, occupation of Alcatraz. And I think what I learned from Dolores and also from my mom is that to make change, it takes a long ass time. You know, it doesn't come overnight, and the trajectory is, you know, you're doing work now that might show, you know, fruits 20, 40, 50 years, or maybe long after you're even gone. You know, and certainly that's true in the American Indian movement. You know, this struggle's been going on for centuries. But what I learned from Dolores is, you know, Dolores works in D.C., she works in Sacramento, in the state capital, and then she works in the fields itself, in the grassroots. And what was really fascinating to watch making the film is, you know, she still has what she calls activist Tupperware parties, house meetings. And she'll go into a community and they'll have a house meeting, and she'll ask a group, you know, what is important to you? What issue is important to you? What's critical in this community? And what would you like to change? What would you like to see happen? And then they get a chalkboard and they put all the priorities, and then they pick one or two of those. And then they say, okay, well, it's school suspensions of Latino and African American students, disproportionate rates of suspensions. How can we change that? Let's get somebody on the school board. You run, you know. And we met this woman named Leticia who had, she didn't even have a high school education. Her English was spotty, you know, she's an immigrant. And she was terrified of the system But Dolores convinced her that she had the power to not only run, but win. She's on the school board and the water board. You know, they're in the Central Valley, a lot of the water is tainted with pesticide poisoning. You know, it's in the water table, arsenic. So a lot of the farm workers can't drink the water from the faucet, and they have to not only pay the water bill, but they have to, you know, buy, you know, crates of water to drink. And so she got on the water board to try to address some of these things. And so it really starts at that grassroots level, and then she also lobbies on the state level, and then she also lobbies on the national. And then I think the biggest thing, certainly with the midterms coming up, is she drives people to vote. Because when you don't vote, you give away your power. You let somebody else make those decisions for you, whether at the local, state, or national level. So I think that's how she sees. You have to affect policy to make the change. And sometimes that also takes a long time. She always says, you know, it's great to march, you know, but that's not enough. You know, you have to vote. You have to get in and change policy. And in order to do that, you have to run. And I think a lot of people are starting to do that today. So I hope that roundabout way of answering your question.
More lighthearted note, was Carlos Santana involved in the sound design or anything for Dolores?
Carlos was the most ideal collaborator, and he was such a positive force. And you know, when we met, you know, he's known Dolores for a long time, and when he was, you know, in Mission High School in the Mission District in San Francisco, he would, and just starting out, he would go and do free concerts for the farm workers to raise money. So he and Dolores, they go way, way back. And one of the areas where they really connected, and I think, you know, my belief was it was one of the inspirations for the film, is they were hanging out one time and they started, you know, talking to the wee hours of the night, and Carlos's favorite musician is Miles Davis. And so he started talking about jazz with Dolores, and Dolores' favorite musician is Charlie Parker. She's a jazz aficionado. And so they had this deep connection on jazz. And so when Carlos called me, he was like, "Did you know Dolores Huerta likes jazz? We got to make a movie." You know, so music is very important to him and to her. And so that really was kind of like the kernel of the conversation. And so when we had the initial talks, you know, like jazz was going to have a place in the film, and music, and the film was going to illuminate not only her political activist side, but her, you know, the side that we can all relate to, you know. And let me just say that, you know, I didn't get in the game just because, you know, like I want to like social activism. I love movies. I mean, I love telling stories, and everybody loves watching and taking in stories, you know, whether it's on Hulu or Netflix or at the theater or on your, you know, your smartphone. You know, the world loves movies. Gabriela was just telling me that, you know, you now have a cinema department, and there's more and more young people that want to get into, you know, the game of telling stories. You know, and the medium is really wide open right now with all these different platforms. And I was sharing, you know, that the documentary format itself is changing every year. You know, in the movie business right now, you know, Netflix is the black hole. They're investing over $10 billion in creating original content. Feature for television, short form content, documentary. Documentary is now a lucrative business. So there's increasing demand for all kinds of content. And you know, there's like the tentpole Hollywood films that, you know, try to get everyone in at the same time. But a lot of film that's being done right now it's made directly for a niche market, you know. So, you know, authentic stories, you know, for a certain group of people. There's like a platform for everything. So it's actually a really exciting time to, you know, to be involved in the medium. And I think you'll see in not just this school, but other schools and communities, young people are like coming in droves because they want to be storytellers.
You know, there's a lot of very personal information about Dolores. Obviously, it's her story, but getting into her relationships with her children. And we were talking about why do you think that is that it gets so deep into those questions. And one young woman stood up in the class and said, "I couldn't appreciate more seeing that struggle because that's something that I deal with on a daily basis. I want to be involved, I have kids, I have all these other things to attend to, and it's a sacrifice that I really have to think hard about. And then another question was, seeing this sort of fired up, there's an energy in the movie of not only Dolores, but all the people around her. Like, is this kind of action possible at our moment in time? And another young person stood up and said, well, yeah, it is possible and it's going on. We see it in our community around getting a no vote on Measure 105 here in Oregon. And so I just was wondering if you could comment on either of those issues and or if there were similar stories that have come up as you've seen the film shared and discussed that have impacted you.
I won't repeat those questions, but I think you all heard. Yeah, I, in terms of wanting to incorporate so much of her personal story in the overall narrative, as we're talking about the changing format of documentary filmmaking, they are becoming, I feel like you see fewer and fewer films, particularly, biographies of individuals where there's a voiceover and it's like this historical figure and, they're kind of sanitized a little bit. I feel like people are not making those films. I mean, they still are, on the History Channel, and you see those kinds of things. But I think where you see a lot of, HBO and these new kind of platforms are really financing films that tell a compelling story. And in order to tell a compelling story, in order for the audience to relate to the story, oftentimes it's grounded in the human element. In preparing for this film, we watched a lot. There's like a dozen documentaries that were done on the UFW and Cesar Chavez in particular, and they don't really get into the personal, and they're a little sanitized, and so there's always a little emotional distance, and yet it's a riveting, emotional, compelling story, both Cesar's story, Dolores' and other farm workers in the struggle. And so when Carlos and I first were talking, and when I was visiting with Dolores, I said, the only way I would get involved if we could go there. You know what I mean? And sometimes that was difficult and challenging, I think, for her and her family. But you could talk about her work, but a lot of times what people remember is like, whoa, man, she had 3 husbands and 11 kids. How did she do all that? And people take that away. They connect with her on a very personal level. And I think particularly women and Latina women who today are sometimes working 2-3 jobs, and still trying to take care of their families and still trying to stay involved in the community. And so a lot of people can relate to that. And I think you see a lot of docs like that being told today where audiences can find an avenue into the film from a very human place, whether it's about Amy Winehouse or any other figure or subject. What was it? What was the Wild Wild Country that was on Netflix? It was like an 8-part. It took place in Elk, California, and I heard that the public library out that way just had over 40 hours of 16mm footage, and they found that by accident, and it was so compelling. And then they kind of staged it like a thriller. There's like killing and guns and sex, and so they told this very compelling story, and it was a blockbuster. Everybody was talking about that film, as well as you could look at it from other other intersections of activism, race, gender, the 60s, coming out of the 60s, spirituality, new age, exploitation, manipulation. But it was a really fascinating way to tell a story. But people found a personal in, no matter who no matter who you are, you found a personal in. And then the second part of your question, help me out.
About how the film portrays a moment of inertia and energy around social activism, environmental activism, and if you see some of those things going on today and people's response today to that.
Right. I think Dolores and Angela Davis said it best. That at that time in the 60s, in the 70s, there was a palpable energy across the country. And you felt like it was possible to change the world. I mean, you're coming out of the 40s and the 50s. You know, the women's movement is coming to fruition. The environmental movement is awakening. The Black Power movement, the Brown Power movement. You know, Red Power. All these movements are coming up, and people want to change. The peace movement, anti-Vietnam. And so I think there was an electricity. I don't know if that's true today, but you know, people have asked Dolores at screenings, you know, God, today, what do we do? And Dolores, as well as other activists I've heard say, like, this is one of the most exciting times to be alive, you know, because there's so much work to do. And I think you see it happening, like on the way over here. We were talking about Parkland. You know, these young people who are mobilizing, you know, wanting to talk about Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. You know, these mass shootings, they want to talk about this, and it's a mass movement now. The Me Too movement. I mean, people are mobilizing, and you know, obviously we have these devices today, the social media. But I think it's still possible, and I'm with Dolores that this is an exciting time, and Dolores uses every opportunity. Every time we do Q&A, she'll use it to organize people. In fact, at one screening we did it at USC, just when the film was coming out, we did a screening at the USC Film School, and there were about 100 dreamers. And you know, they just struck down DACA, and this young dreamer stood up. She was 21 years old, and she was crying, and she confessed to Dolores that she was thinking of taking her own life. She had nothing to go back to, and she said, you know, she prayed to God for a sign, and she ended up seeing this film. She goes, "You are my sign, Dolores." And then right after that, Dolores got everybody. There was a DACA rally around the corner. She got everyone in the theater to march out with her to go to the rally where she spoke and fired people up. You know, so I think some of her energy is contagious, and audiences pick it. It comes off the screen, so to speak, and it ignites people.
Yeah. I have two questions. One, how you understand feminist, and how you going to explain to female and male what it means to be feminist. How do you think you can influence this understanding? And last, I heard in the news that Latino people are actually very conservative, a lot of them, and you engage them to go vote, and then they vote Republican. So do you have any more explanation about that?
Let me break it down. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Yeah, what I learned making this film from Dolores is that the fight for social justice is really about everyone, a woman, a man, white, black, brown, young, old, queer, straight, is really, it's really the quest for dignity, to everyone to have dignity. And that also implies to have, you know, equality. So when you talk about a feminist, the way I understand it, how I approached it, is a feminist is somebody who supports immigration rights, who supports racial justice, environmental justice. And I think through Dolores' life and her work, you see where those issues intersect and how they're really all connected. So that in terms of what is a feminist, I mean, everyone has their idea. I have my own personal idea. I consider myself a feminist. But I really believe those struggles are all connected, and that they, at their most basic level, it's really the struggle for dignity. And we see certain groups, their dignity is denied, and has been for a long time. And with that, their humanity, and with that, their rights. So the other part of your question, you know, I try not to turn one community into like all Latinos are not the same. Yeah. I wouldn't even say most. And you know, and then what is a Latino? You know, a Latino can be a white person, could be a Afro-Latino, could be a Euro-Latino, could be an indigenous person, could be rich, could be poor, and so they're, you know, that's a huge thing. It's like saying, what is an American? You know, everyone in here is an American, except, well, excuse me. You know, it's hard to put everyone into one group. So I know there is a conservative branch within the Latino community, just like there is, you know, in any other community. But I think in general, the Latino people, we do need to mobilize. You know, we need to exercise our political voice and our political might, and we're not right now.
I was curious about your experience with both fiction filmmaking and documentary filmmaking and its connection to social change. Do you feel like there's room for fiction filmmaking to affect social change, or do you think really documentary is the more effective road for that?
I think if they're both different forms of telling a story, but you're still telling a story. So, you know, I think stories really inform, whether, you know, they're stories in the Bible or they come through oral tradition, whether they were told 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago or today. They, you know, we live through the stories we tell ourselves as a people. That's where the values come from. It's what's passed down. So I think stories, like as I shared with you earlier, when I started watching the American musical and writing from a Marxist feminist perspective, I had no idea how so many of my perceptions had been informed by the stories I grew up watching, you know, about black people, about white people, about women, about men, and about my own people. You know, had been informed by like all the television shows, the cartoons, the Hallmark movies, the Christmas movies, you know, Dick and Jane in the history books. Those are stories too. So do I think stories can affect change? They can. And I think even genre films are informing and impacting the culture and our perceptions every single day. You know, this movie Black Panther that came out, like set global records. It was a Marvel movie, it was a comic movie, but what was really profound about it was that it used all black people, writing, directing, starring, and it made no apologies. And it told a great action story. It was a genre film, but it had a huge impact. You know, just in the nature of its structure. Just to have, you know, a film that was over $100 million, starring all black people, written by two black men and directed by a black man. You know, that in and of itself, you know, is a powerful, powerful thing. And you can't stop it now. You know, it's a freight train, and the demographics of the country are changing, and I think there's going to be more and more demand for diverse content, you know, and I think, you know, and then you had the other one, Crazy Rich Asians, you know. Does it still embrace, you know, a lot of the same values, you know, that we see in other genre films? Yeah, it does. But what was powerful about it was a global phenomenon. It made a lot of money, and it started all Asian folk, you know. And I think the industry is kind of realizing, wow, we can make money, you know. We don't have to use white people all the time, you know. Yeah. That the white story and the white character is not the universal, you know what I mean? And I think that's the power of story, because even growing up, you know, I was born in '62, and all the television shows and the movies, you know, starring white folks, You know, all the Christmas movies I love. You know, It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart. I watched them all, but it was always white folks that I was comparing my family to. You know, and the men, masculinity. You know, I mean, all the different things. But you're constantly measuring yourself and chiseling out an identity about who you are and what you value by what you're taking in.
On that line, can you talk about transitioning to documentary film specifically, and what struggles or lessons I guess you learned about telling a real, nonfiction story?
I mean, I just applied what I knew, and so what I always try to encourage young filmmakers to do is to watch a ton of movies, narrative films, doc films, read screenplays, read treatments, and really, really master structure. So I took the craft of screenwriting and genre, dramatic storytelling, and I applied it to the doc medium. You know, you still have to engage your audience. You have to entertain them. You know, you have to lead them. You have to create suspense. You have to, especially during Act 2. That's the toughest act of any film. You know, doc or narrative is that middle section. How do you hold the interest? And so, that's where the craft comes in. And so I just use what I knew, and that's structuring like a narrative film, 3 acts, taking the audience, constantly raising the stakes, what's compelling. And I mean, we were lucky in that Dolores' story, it had this incredible heart and soul at the center of it. And if we could get the audience to feel and experience some of that heart and soul, then we were victorious. And that's how we kind of went after it. Yeah. And we knew that the family story, the family aspect of her story was going to be the heart. Yeah.
As an independent filmmaker, do you ever feel yourself pull or feel that there's tension between the stories that you want to tell and having the financial ability to do that? You mentioned this moment where you, maybe when you were in college, when you saw that some stories get told and some don't. And it sounds like you kind of want to tell the stories that don't get told. Do you ever feel tension between wanting to do that and being able to?
Yeah, I think what inspired me was, it's not that I want to tell the stories that don't get told. I just wanted to tell the stories that I was familiar with, the people and the struggles of the people, in my life experience. And because they didn't exist. And so I start from there, and I think you have to find, no matter who you are, I think you have to find what that personal, connective tissue is for you into the subject. Certainly where the limitations come in is, you don't, like with La Mission, we shot it in 21 days, and you wish, when I storyboard everything, so, I had all this idea, I wanted to get all this kind of coverage. I think we had this big finale, the Aztec dancers, and it was scheduled for a 1.5-day shoot, but the way things went, it's like Mehdi says, you have 4 hours. And so, you always want more time, and you wish you had, more equipment maybe, more time in the edit. But you make a gift of necessity, and you have to make do. And I think sometimes, independent filmmakers, they're forced to become more creative because you do have these limitations of time and money. But I'm hoping that that will change, and that one day we'll have the absolute max time to do exactly what we want.
So you talked about how difficult it was to raise funds in independent filmmaking. It is true. When you hit those low points during that process, and when you feel like you're not going to make it, you can't raise the capital to make your film, what energized you?
That's a great question, because the process is fraught from beginning to end, and ongoing. You know, writing a screenplay, and then or a treatment for the doc, and then you hand it out to your peers and your friends and your family, and you get feedback that says this sucks. You know, you're just like, oh God. And then you go back and you retool it, and you get it back, and well, this is a little better, but it still sucks. You know, so you're constantly getting discouraged in the creative process. And you run into obstacles in the creative process that you have to find solutions to. And then the big test is, you know, trying, like you say, you can raise the money, and that's a long process, and you'll hear 1,000 no's for every one yes. And that can just really get you depressed. And you want to give up so many times. You know, and then miraculously you get the film done in the can, you submit it to a festival, and you hope and pray you get into one of the premier festivals. You know. But if you don't, it's really depressing, because that's usually your avenue to a distributor. You know, there are a lot of festivals all over the world, but distributors buyers only go to certain ones. And so then, you know, you have that obstacle to climb. And then when the film comes out, then you have critics' response. And sometimes, you know, critics show no mercy. And sometimes you don't want to even get out of bed, you know. And you have to find a reason to continue on. So for me, it always comes back to like the intention you began with about why the work spoke to you in the first place. And you know, for me, when somebody from this world, this community sees the film and they feel transformed by it, or they feel inspired or compelled to all of a sudden turn their life and go, and I want to do this now because I saw this. That for me, that's enough, you know, and it just pushes you to go, you know, to continue. So I'm a glutton for punishment, and I'm signing up for a couple more projects, you know. But you have to find those kernels, and I think, you know, what I also saw, I asked Dolores this question and Angela Davis, you know, like, how do you sustain, especially as an organizer and an activist, they probably experience more defeats than victories. And sometimes, you know, huge loss, including, you know, relatives and close people being killed. How do you continue on? And both had a similar answer, and that is, you know, you find solace and love and compassion in the community in which you struggle. And I think that's, for me, that's too, you know, at the end of the day, I come home and my family and my community, there's still a lot of struggle. And when I you know, compare my own life struggles to what is happening around me, you know, I feel like I have to continue, you know.
Asking is, when you have a story to tell, how much of it do you try to present neutrally versus how much do you try to convince people that what's going on is important and this is why?
That's a great question, and I think because the industry is dominated by, you know, a certain minority of folks who come from a similar, you know, perspective, sometimes bringing content from another community that has maybe other values, that can be challenging because you're always trying to convince them that, you know, no, this is great, this has meaning, you know, this is meaningful, this is worth making. So I think you always have to deal with that. The second part of it, and I'm learning this as I still, like, I'm a student of film, so I'm constantly learning. But what I feel like if you really craft the story, oftentimes within the structure itself is the implicit and explicit messaging that you want. So, for instance, you know, Black Panther, I brought that up. It didn't have to say, you know, Black Power, you know, because within the process, within its structure of the story itself, but then also part of the narrative of that film was that it was outside of the film, was that it was, you know, a Black director and black writers, black actors. Like that was part of the marketing. But the film is such an affirmation of black beauty and black beingness that, you know, the film didn't have to say it. You know, it was implicit. And that's a very powerful message. So I feel like like in Dolores, we just tried to use a compelling story, a structure that kind of fit her, and that centered the family, her personal narrative within her work. We want everyone, white folks, black folks, queer folks, straight, women, men, to kind of go into her world and say, oh my God, Dolores is this phenomenal, complex, flawed, but phenomenal, powerful human being. And so, we tried to we didn't say that, but through the structure, you hopefully create an avenue for the viewer to get it. And there's an implicit and messaging in that, I think. So I hope that answered your question. Yeah. It's a little meta.
Well, I haven't seen any of your films, so I look forward to seeing them.
Great.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.